Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Publishing Websites lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. As the name implies, in this lesson you're going to learn how to publish websites, starting with understanding what it takes to create a web publishing rule. You'll also learn about some other web publishing details and web server farm considerations, and wrapped up in here are some discussions about how you can authenticate differently with different rules in Threat Management Gateway. But we're really going to be focusing on the good stuff in this lesson, and that's publishing the GlobalMantix public intranet and publishing the GlobalMantix secure intranet. That's going to be the major focus of this lesson, is the two demonstrations, and we're going to be walking through a lot of the options there. GlobalMantix runs a number of websites, including an internal employee intranet that works with simple HTTP with no authentication, and a more secure internal site that does require authentication. You're going to publish these two sites so that they're available from the internet. By the end of this lesson, you'll learn how to make internal resources accessible to outside audiences, and you'll gain an understanding of where authentication options matter in this process. Now, we're not going to be getting into HTTPS and SSL in this lesson. In the Exchange lesson in this course, we're going to get into that pretty heavily, and you're going to see where certificates start to play a role pretty significantly in the use of Threat Management Gateway. One of the things that's important to realize up front is that web publishing is a bit more complex than generalized server publishing. Previously, we published an RDP server, and that was a pretty straightforward process. When it comes to web publishing, there's a lot more options that you can work with. And that's because there's just a lot more you can do with it. Most of the time, in a lot of cases, this is what you're going to be doing, is publishing various websites for external access. You may use things like server publishing to deploy specific services, such as the aforementioned RDP rule that allowed us to remotely control the domain controller. But that's pretty straightforward. First of all, just like you can in any rule on Threat Management Gateway, you have to choose your rule type, which is to allow or deny a specific kind of traffic. But then things change a little bit. You got to decide what you want to publish: a single website, a server farm, or multiple websites. Now, just because you choose multiple websites doesn't mean that you're going to create one rule that has a whole bunch of different elements. There will be a separate rule created for each website that you want to publish. Next up, you have different web server security options than you'd have with generalized server publishing. You have the option of using SSL or HTTPS, or not using SSL with HTTP. It's important to understand that not using SSL can result in passwords being transmitted in plain text over the internet. For example, consider this scenario. You have a website that's internally housed that runs on port 80 but requires authentication. That port 80 website does not require SSL. So in other words, all traffic to and from that site is unencrypted, including the password transmission potentially, depending on the authentication method being used. So in other words, that password can be seen by those listening in on the communication, and it's a relatively insecure way to publish an internal site that requires a password. When you create a web publishing rule in Threat Management Gateway, you have to provide some internal publishing details. For example, if internal names are not defined in your DNS system, you can allow Threat Management Gateway to simply use the internal computer name or the IP address directly. And then you could actually focus on the external DNS and allow Threat Management Gateway to do the translation or the bridging between the two names. You also have to provide publishing path information. For example, where is the content that you're trying to serve up housed? And you can also decide if you want to use the original host headers information or if you would like to have it replaced. With a web publishing rule, you also need to provide Threat Management Gateway with details about the public name you plan to use. Remember, the public name that you publish can be different than the internal server name. And just as the case was with server publishing, you have to configure listeners. This will indicate the external IP address and port to which a client makes a connection, and you can use an existing listener or create a new one. As I mentioned, web publishing rules are associated with these listeners so the communications work. So once you create the publishing rule, you can create the associated listener, bring the two together, and then the overall communication flow is built. Web publishing rules rely on the use of the web proxy filter and support only HTTP and HTTPS protocols. And that really makes sense because websites don't run on other protocols. We're going to go over and take a look at the web filters and Threat Management Gateway to better understand the relationship, and we'll do that when we go over to the demonstrations. And when you create a web publishing rule in Threat Management Gateway, you can use the test rule button that you'll see to see if your settings work, and this will help you more quickly identify potential issues with your web publishing rule. Particularly for secure sites, authentication is a big deal. You want users to be able to authenticate to make sure that only authorized people are gaining access to the resources that you publish on the internet. Threat Management Gateway supports something called authentication delegation, which allows you to configure the Threat Management Gateway server to simply forward credentials to a web server after initial authorization takes place at the firewall level. Basically, what this does is adds an additional layer of security to your environment. Only authenticated requests will make their way to the web server. This will add a little bit of additional burden to your Threat Management Gateway system because it has to handle that authentication, but it requires a little bit less burden on the web server for the same reason. That authentication is already being handled elsewhere, so it can focus on serving the resource. Some of the options you have with regard to authentication are to answer the question, is authentication delegation allowed? Basically, do you want to have the Threat Management Gateway server handle any authentication tasks, or do you want the web server to handle those directly? Can the client authenticate directly? Is it allowed for a client to go through the Threat Management Gateway server and have the web server authenticate that client directly, or do we disallow that kind of action? And then what authentication mechanisms are actually enabled? Plain text authentication, things like that. For more information about authentication delegation, there's a link on your screen that provides you with a wealth of information that's well beyond the scope of this lesson. One of the nice things about web publishing rules is you can use HTTP policy as a part of the web publishing rule. Now, we discussed HTTP policy in the Configuring HTTP lesson in this course. And you can use these policies in web publishing rules just as you can in the access rules in which we did modify the HTTP policy earlier. You can block specific HTTP headers, for example, or block unwanted HTTP methods. For example, suppose you don't want external users under any circumstances to be able to use the post method to your web server. You could block that method as an additional layer of security that would otherwise not be available. There are many more details about HTTP policy discussed in the Configuring HTTP lesson in this course. And as is the case for all of the rules that we've talked about in this course, you can create a schedule that allows access to a published resource on a schedule that you determine. And there are 3 default scheduling rules in Threat Management Gateway. The all access or all the time rule, which is 24/7 access, or working hours and non-working hours. Or you can create any schedule you like to meet your organization's needs. Threat Management Gateway also supports something called link translation. Particularly if your internal machine name and your external machine name, that is the web server machine name, are different, none of your links would work if you don't translate them to something friendly to the client. For example, internally your web server might be named web server, but externally you're calling it public. If you don't modify the links or translate them to something friendly, the external resource will not be able to access any of the links that are on your website. So this will translate your internal machine names to internet-friendly public names in the rule. And we're actually going to be doing that for GlobalMantics. In the server publishing lesson, I briefly discussed bridging, but we're actually going to see it in action in this lesson. Bridging is the mechanism by which a threat management gateway system can redirect port and protocol in a way that's transparent to the client. So basically, what the client is pointing to and what threat management gateway is using for a connection to the published resource can be very different. If the GlobalMantics website, for example, runs on port 8080 internally, the web publishing rule can be configured so that the resource is accessed from the external internet on port 80 with Threat Management Gateway handling the bridging. Basically, the server will be published on port 8080 and the listener will listen on port 80, and those two things will be bound together through a bridge. And that's what we're going to be doing in this lesson when we publish one of the GlobalMantics sites. If you're publishing more than just a single website, there's some things you need to keep in mind. Although GlobalMantics is only going to be publishing a single website, web server farms have special considerations. First of all, when you configure the new web publishing rule, you'll choose to publish a web server farm rather than a single website. And when you do that, you have the option to choose a load balancing method or affinity method. Now, what that basically does is determine how user sessions are going to be associated with published servers. So remember, when you're publishing a farm, you're publishing access to more than one resource with a single rule. And in some way, shape, or form, requests have to be balanced between those resources, and then connectivity to those sessions or to those machines has to be maintained in some way. Because the state of the session is important in a lot of ways. You have to make sure that the session doesn't sit there and just bounce back and forth between servers. If you use the recommended cookie-based load balancing method, the user session itself is associated with the server. This provides more reliability when a server is restarted. So if you have to restart a server, the client-based cookie will then attempt to repoint that machine, the client, to the restarted server from an affinity perspective. You can also use what's called source IP-based load balancing. And this is where the client IP address is associated with the server. Now, this should actually be used in some cases where session affinity can't be used because cookies aren't supported. One such service that does not support cookies is Exchange RPC over HTTP or Outlook Anywhere in a publishing scenario. Once connected in this way, the user session does persist on one server. Now, we're on to the meat of the lesson, and this is where we're going to publish the GlobalMantics public intranet. The GlobalMantics public intranet doesn't contain any privileged information, and it's generally used only by GlobalMantics employees, although the company doesn't really care who sees the information. So it's sort of like publishing a regular website, but in this case, it happens to be the intranet. Here's the details. This is going to be accessed externally by using the DNS name pub-intranet.globalmantics.com with an external IP address of 192.168.160.253. The external port is port 80. The internal name is open.globalmantics.com. We're going to use what's called link translation so that anything that has a resource link published on open.globalmantics.com can link best as pub-intranet.globalmantics.com from the outside world. And I'll show you that when we get into the lesson. The internal IP address is 172.16.0.253. And this server exists in the perimeter network for GlobalMantics, not internal. And it's also running on port 85, so we're going to be using bridging to bridge between port 80 and port 85. And we'll review all of the possible publishing options when we get into that scenario. And we're going to go over right now to the GlobalMantics Threat Management Gateway environment and configure this publishing rule. We'll start on the web server itself in the perimeter network by just validating all of the settings that I mentioned before. I'm here at a command prompt, and you notice that I've typed nslookup-open, and I get a response saying that that IP address is 172.16.0.253. So open.globalmantics.com, that's as an internal name, does match the IP address that I mentioned before. Now, to see where Open is running, I've opened up the IIS Manager on the web server. And I'll right-click Open and choose Edit Bindings to get the information that I need. And you'll see indeed that this web server is running on port 85 rather than port 80. And I can browse to open.globalmantics.com from here if I'd like, just to validate that everything works. And one thing I want to bring to your attention is that when I hover my mouse over the link to page 1, at the bottom of the page, in the bottom of that window, notice that it says, I'm going to link to open.globalmantics.com:85/page1.htm. And when I click on it, I'm brought to page 1 of the website. Yes, this is a really, really terrible intranet. It has very little information. But what I'm interested in showing you here is that link translation works in the way we want it to work. When I'm internal, because I'm browsing to open.globalmantics.com, I'm being linked to page 1 through open.globalmantics.com. Now I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server, and we're going to create a rule and a listener. As was the case for server publishing rules, I'm at the firewall policy area, but this time I'm going to choose to publish a website. So I'll click Publish Websites in the Tasks area, and this will start the new web publishing rule wizard. I'm going to call this open.globalmantics.com and click Next. Again, to select rule action, I want to allow this kind of traffic, so I'll click Next. And I'm going to publish a single website in this case, although I could publish a server farm or multiple websites. And notice if I choose multiple websites, a new rule will be created for each website published, as I mentioned before. And click Next. In this case, this is non-secured traffic, so I'm just not going to use SSL. This will just use an HTTP connection as denoted in the little diagram to the right. Click Next again. The internal site name is open.globalmantics.com. Now, if I wanted to, or if I didn't have an internal site name, I could choose to use a computer name or IP address instead. Well, I've already got this configured in DNS, and I've shown you that it works, so we're just going to use that internal site name. And I'll click Next again. For internal publishing details, I don't really need to do anything because the defaults are just fine. So I'll click Next once again. And again, I'm going to choose. Here's where I'm going to provide the public name that I mentioned. So this one is pub-intranet.globalmantics.com. And this is the public name. So remember, this is different than the open.globalmantics.com that we just had. And I'll click Next once again. Now I've got to create a new listener. I don't have a listener that's appropriate for this use, so I'll click New. The name of my listener is going to be open.globalmantics.com. I'll click Next. I do not require SSL for this particular listener. Click Next again. It's an external facing listener. We talked about to which network adapters listeners should be bound in the server publishing lesson. In this case, because I'm accessing this resource from the internet, I need to bind it to the external network adapter. And I need to click Select IP Addresses. I want to have a specific IP address for this listener. So I'll choose Specified IP Address, and then I've got this 192.168.160.253, which is the external IP address I wish to use. And I'll click OK. And you'll notice that now our listener is bound to a specific IP address on the external network adapter. Click Next again. I don't have any authentication needs here, so I'll just choose No Authentication. And Next again. Single sign-on is something that you can enable with Threat Management Gateway if you like. Now, single sign-on is not available for this particular client authentication method because there's no authentication. Single sign-on assumes you're going to be authenticating in some way, shape, or form. If you are trying to use Forefront Threat Management Gateway to front-end a number of different internal resources, you can use single sign-on so that users only have to log in once. Click Next, and we're at the summary page on which I'll simply click Finish. Okay, that created the listener. So I've created the listener. I'll click Next here. I don't really have any authentication needs. So you'll see here I can have no delegation and client cannot authenticate directly, or no delegation but client may authenticate directly. It doesn't really matter which one I choose because there's no authentication necessary for this particular website. Click Next. I want everyone to be able to use this rule, so I'll click Next again. And now I'm going to finish the new web publishing rule and click Finish. And you'll see that I've got in my Scott's Test Rules area where I play around a little bit, I have open.globalmantics.com as the first rule. Now I can change the order of the rule if I like, and you learned about rule order previously in this course. So I'll simply click Apply and OK. Now if I open this rule, you're going to see that there's lots and lots of information here. I want to run through the tabs before we actually do the testing. The general page is exactly what you'd expect. It's the name of the rule, description, and whether or not the rule is enabled or disabled. On the Actions tab, we can allow or deny, and we can choose our logging option. On the From tab, we're allowing traffic from anywhere, and again, we can restrict this if we like. So if we want to allow simply a partner to have access to this particular web resource, we can put their IP range in as a network set and then use that here instead. Here's where we're going to open.globalmantics.com. On the traffic rule, this rule applies to traffic of the following protocols, just HTTP. Then we have the listener, and if we wanted to, we can open up the properties of the listener and make modifications. but we don't need to do that. On the public name tab, this is where we're going to allow anything that's going to pub-intranet.globalmantics.com. Then we saw the paths information before. We don't really need to make any modifications. Here's authentication delegation that we saw before. If we have any custom application settings, we don't need to worry about most of these things for here. What I want to go to is the bridging tab. So we're going to redirect requests here. The problem is the internal web server is running on port 85. So we're going to change this to port 85. And we'll click apply. Then we have users. Those are pretty self-explanatory as a schedule. And then link translation. We do want to apply link translation to the rule. Basically, any links will be translated to the public name, which is what we really need to have happen. And then I'll click OK. Now, as is the norm, we have to apply the change to the firewall. So I'll click apply. And then we're going to go over to an external machine and validate the DNS settings that we have in place. And then we're going to test the rule. I have in front of you is an external DNS server that happens to host the globalmantics.com domain for the external resources. And you can see we have two entries in this zone. We have pub-intranet that points to 192.168.160.253, which is the IP address on which we've published the rule that we just saw. We also have this one called secure-intranet that we'll be using in the next demonstration. Now, I'm going to go over to a Windows 7 machine for GlobalMantics that happens to be housed outside the network, and we're going to test this rule to make sure that it works. And as you can see by the banner on the top of the page, we're now here at win7-external, which is a Windows 7 host, and I'm going to type pub-intranet.globalmantics.com. Notice I'm not suffixing this with a port number. Remember, that internal site runs on port 85, but the web listener lives on port 80. So when I do pub-intranet.globalmantics.com, I do get the GlobalMantics site. Now, further, when I browse over page 1, if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll notice that the link is pub-intranet.globalmantics.com, not open.globalmantics.com. This tells me that all of the stuff that I put into place works just fine, and that this site is now published and usable by whoever needs to use it. The GlobalMantics secure intranet does contain some privileged information and should be accessible only to authorized users. That means that it needs to be able to use some kind of authentication mechanism to lock people out that don't have access to the site. For this purpose, a dedicated IIS site has been created on the GlobalMantics web server, and we'll take a look at it in just a second. In this particular case, we're going to have an external name of secure-intranet.globalmantics.com with an external IP address of 192.168.160.252, and it's going to run on port 80. The internal name is secure.globalmantics.com with the IP address you see on your screen, again on port 80. We're not going to be using SSL to protect this particular site because we'll be getting into SSL in the Exchange lesson when we publish Outlook Web Access, and you'll get an understanding of what it takes to publish an SSL site in Threat Management Gateway. So I'm going to first go over to the web server and show you its configuration briefly, and then we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server and create a published server and a listener, a web listener, for this configuration. And then we're going to go to an external machine and we're going to test it to make sure that we actually get the authentication that we expect. Now, before I jump over to the servers, let me make sure you're aware what you saw a few minutes ago in this lesson with the open site is very different than what you're going to see right now. The reason is because there's been some time that's passed since the recording of the open demo and this particular secure intranet demonstration. So what you saw on the Threat Management Gateway system earlier is not going to be what you see now. There is nothing wrong with your screen. But I wanted to start out with a discussion about the authentication option that we have for the secure intranet site. So we have the secure site, and if I go to authentication, you're going to notice that we have basic authentication enabled for this site. And just to prove that it actually does do that, we're going to browse to http://secure.globalmantics.com/index.htm, and you'll notice that it does in fact ask for some credentials. And once those are provided, then I'm allowed to log in to the secure site. And that's what we wanted, was to be able to have this as a more secure site than we had before. And now I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system, and we're going to create the rules that'll make this accessible from the internet. And here I am in the Threat Management Gateway console. We've been here before, so I'm just going to get started. I'm going to choose Publish Websites, and the publishing rule name is going to be Secure. We're going to allow traffic, so I'll click Next. We're going to publish a single website, so I'll click Next again. We will not be using SSL, so I'll click Next there. The internal site name is secure.globalmantics.com. And then we'll click Next. We don't need to worry about anything on this page, so I'll simply click Next again. And we're going to accept requests for secure-intranet.globalmantics.com. And click Next. We got to create a new web listener, so we'll click New. And this is going to be for the secure site. We'll call it secure-wl. Again, we're not going to require SSL, so we'll click Next. We have to decide on an IP address that we want to use for this particular web listener. We're not going to use all unavailable or all IP addresses, so we're going to choose external and then click Select IP addresses. We want to verify the IP address we're going to use for this service, so I'm going to go back out to PowerPoint for a second. It's 160.252, and you'll see that shows up right here. So I'll select it and click Add, and then click OK. And you're going to see that that's now the selected IP address for use by this service. And click Next. Clients aren't going to provide any authentication to Threat Management Gateway itself. So click Next, and Next again. Once again, we'll hit Next. Now, we weren't going to have any authentication to Threat Management Gateway, but we do want to allow the client to authenticate directly against the web server. Otherwise, they won't be able to log in. So we're not going to have any authentication delegation, but the client will authenticate directly or can authenticate directly against that web server. So we'll click Next. And we're going to add all users. Yeah, all users is fine for this rule. Anybody who's associated with GlobalMantics will be allowed to log in to the web server. So we'll click Next and Finish. Not too hard. So now we'll click the Apply button, and we'll apply those settings changes to the Threat Management Gateway system. And I'm going to wait for a minute before I go over to the external system, just to make sure that there's nothing that's going to be waiting for any kind of a timeout. So I'm going to pause the video, and then when we come back, we'll be over on the external system. We're now on our external machine, and we're going to see that we actually have a failure, which is what I wanted to demonstrate, something that we saw earlier that I skipped past that I want to go back and correct, but I wanted to show it to you. First of all, I want to show you that we do indeed have an external DNS entry for secure-intranet.globalmantics.com, which is 160.252. Now, if I go to secure-intranet.globalmantics.com/index.htm, it's going to fail. But I get some technical information at the bottom that says Forefront Threat Management Gateway is configured to block HTTP requests that require authentication. I skipped that before. I'm going to go back and correct that right now. Let me show you where we do that. I'll open the rule. Here's the rule called Secure. Double click it. Now I'm going to go to the Listener tab, and I'm going to go to Properties. I'm then going to go to the Authentication tab, and I'm going to go to the Advanced button at the bottom of the page. And I'm going to select the checkbox next to Allow Client Authentication over HTTP. So click Apply, and OK, and OK, and OK, and then Apply again. And now, once that's taken care of, I should be able to authenticate to that machine exactly the way I want to, because we've now basically told the Threat Management Gateway, I know this is insecure, but I want to do it anyway. So I'll do slow@globalmantics.com, Welcome to the GlobalMantics secure site. But you can see that it actually did work exactly as we planned. In this lesson, you learned the ins and outs of creating web publishing rules, including understanding some other details that come along with creating web publishing rules, and some considerations you need to take into consideration when you're publishing web server farms. We then wrapped up with a couple of demonstrations. First of all, publishing your typical website, the GlobalMantics public intranet, and then publishing in a secure website, in this case, the GlobalMantics secure intranet. Here's a resource that may help you as you move forward in your own threat management gateway implementation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.